Welcome to session number 50 of Old Testament Survey. We're in the book of Daniel, and we'll begin in chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. This is a difficult section of this little book of Daniel. It's not necessarily difficult, but many people have trouble with it. The underlying interpretation method that I'm using to get a handle on the book of Daniel for us is called literal interpretation. And one of the features of literal interpretation is that I expect the whole book of Daniel to make sense. I expect the whole system to fit together into a whole structure that makes good sense somehow at the literal level. I don't expect it to be a bunch of individual little pieces. The other thing that I expect is that when Daniel announces that here is a thing that has to do with the latter days or the last days or the end times, that end time is in fact still future to us. Those portions of Daniel's prophecy that have not already been fulfilled literally, I expect will be fulfilled literally. Now, as we get into Daniel chapter 8, most of this chapter is fulfilled historically. It's fulfilled literally during the historical period. Chapter 8 expands on two parts of the four-nation time of the Gentiles theme. The ram is Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. The ram is actually Persia, and the he-goat is Alexander the Great. I get it mixed up. So this is a picture of the conflict between the Greco-Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. Persia is modern Iran. It's the high point of the Eastern totalitarian power structure. The emperor of Persia was the most powerful character in the ancient world, and that was to continue well into Christian times. So Persia continued as a major power up until the Muslim conquests. And with that, in the early 700s AD, Persia adopted Islam and became the most important Islamic power. The Muslim empire, if you will, centered in Baghdad, was thoroughly Persian from top to bottom, and expanded into the entire Mediterranean world and went east as far as the Philippines. The Muslims who today are on Mindanao started in Persia. So it is a very, very, very big thing. The Persian Muslim power extended throughout what the Muslims call their golden age, a period of supreme power over the world. And this would last well up into relatively modern times. The end of the Dark Ages in Europe were presided over or brooded over by this Persian and then Turkish Muslim power that will sit off to the south and to the east, and for a big part of that time to the west in Spain. Okay, how to get into all of that? So, chapter 8 of Daniel tells us the Persian side of the story. That's the ram, and the this Persian invasion of the West, an attempt to take Persian power out of Asia Minor and across into Greece. And the clash that takes place there as the Greek power under Alexander the Great fights back. And Alexander the Great is one of the great tales of world history. Alexander established the prominence of Western political, economic, and philosophical priority for all of the rest of history to the present day. Alexander soundly defeated the Persian Empire and drove it back into Mesopotamia, from which it has tried ever since to escape. And Western power, beginning with Alexander the Great, expanded primarily to the west, which is why we call it Western. Took over Europe. Europe took over much of the rest of the world and established a substantially different kind of political, economic, philosophical base. And eventually the Greeks would yield to the Romans, and we call this civilization Greco-Roman. And the Greco-Roman civilization would become Christian. So when we think of Western civilization, which is not just in Europe, but every place where Christianity has gone, we typically call it Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian. So it's a civilization that is built on Greek and Roman philosophic ideals, tempered and thoroughly informed by Jewish and Christian ideas. It is not a Christian empire by any means, but it is full of Christian ideas, and those Christian ideas are built on the foundations of biblical ideas, which are mixed in with the Greek and Roman ideas. Not all of this is good. Most of it is. Most of it has proved to be very practical. Mostly it has proved to be healthy for the world, but of course not everybody agrees with that. Not everybody appreciates peace and prosperity either. It's all interesting stuff. There's a whole lot of modern politics that is all about this. So as we get into this, let me see if I can share my screen. We're going to launch into chapter 8. Yeah, there we go. And let's see if it works. Yes, it's working. Okay, this is the mosaic that was found in Pompeii, south side of the Bay of Naples. The city of Pompeii destroyed by a volcano, Mount Vesuvius, about 80 AD. So roughly 50 years after the time of Christ. This mosaic is today found on the wall of the Archaeological Museum in Naples. One of the most famous mosaics in the whole world, really, because it demonstrates the Battle of Issus, ISSUS, which is in far eastern Turkey at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There's a fairly broad plain, and the little village of Issus guards the ford over the Euphrates at that point. The Persians were trying to retreat. And they decided it was time to put up a defense. It's interesting when we study the battles of Alexander that he really only fought about 5 pitched battles with the Persians. It was, it seems like he ought to have been fighting all day, every day, but it really wasn't true. Alexander had a relatively small, a relatively independent-minded army. His generals under him were volunteers. They each raised their own armies and could have left whenever they wanted to, because the Greeks believed in the principle of eleutheria. The Greek word eleutheria means something like freedom or liberty. And the Greek generals were quite literally free to come and go as they pleased. If it seemed good to them to stay and fight, then that's what they did. Unfortunately for Alexander, there were 4 of them with the armies who went with them, who stayed for the whole campaign. And Alexander moved very quickly to defeat the Persians. Daniel tells this story, and it's fascinating. Daniel is writing probably around 540 BC, at least 300 years, 200 years before the time of Alexander. And we're told that when Alexander found his way to Jerusalem, he was introduced to the book of Daniel. The priests or rabbis or whoever it was in the city of Jerusalem introduced Alexander to this book of Daniel, and Alexander recognized himself. That's the tradition anyway. It would be interesting to know for sure. So it starts out, chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which had appeared to me at first, which would be the vision of chapter 7, the 4 beasts. The 2 beast vision of chapter 8 looks at the 2nd and the 3rd of the 4 beasts. So it's an expansion on what we've already seen. And I saw in the vision, when I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. And I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal with 2 horns. Now, the 2 horns represent the Medes and the Persians. Medes and Persians are different ethnic groups there in Persia, but for our purposes, they don't matter very much. So 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward, and no beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Okay, that's a picture of the great movement out of Susa, that's the capital of Persia at the time. The movement of the Persian king and of the Medes and Persian Empire, and the movement to the north, the west, and the south. South would be into Egypt. To the west would be primarily the Promised Land, Israel. To the north, Asia Minor, and then ultimately Greece. And this is his movement. As I was considering verse 5. Sorry. Behold, a male goat came from the west, across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. So the picture here, a male goat, the he-goat, moving very fast, so fast that his feet didn't touch the ground. One of the great characteristics of Alexander was his ability to move his army very quickly. It was a small army, and he had most of his army was mounted. They were either cavalry or they were in some way horse-drawn or donkey-drawn. Their equipment was all drawn by pack animals. And Alexander was able to get from one place to another much faster than the Persian army. The Persians walked to battle. The Persian army was much larger, but they walked to battle. The other difference between the Greek and Persian armies is that the Greek soldiers themselves were volunteers. That's that Greek notion of freedom. They were free to come and go. And because of that, they stayed for battle because they felt they had a stake in the battle, not because they were forced to. The Persian army is built on the older Eastern concept of slavery. The Persian soldiers, although they could be very fierce soldiers, were slaves. They were essentially servants of the king. And there were very, very few actual leaders in the Persian army. The king himself went into battle, and he had a small staff. And when the king and the staff gave orders, it was orders to the entire army. So the entire army, there could be 40,000 or 100,000 men. The entire army could do one thing at a time. They could march forward, they could go back, they could go left, they could go right, they could attack, they could retreat, but they did the whole thing all at once as one army. The Greeks, on the other hand, were able to move much more quickly, and the individual unit commanders were part of a larger set of orders. And Alexander gave his individual commanders, all the way down to the unit level, significantly more power to make decisions on the ground. So they tended to win battles very quickly. They would do flanking movements and pincers movements and penetrations of the line and exploitation, and they would go in amongst the pack animals. The Greek army was very well known for moving very, very quickly and exploiting the opportunities, and that's the picture as we see it. So here's this male goat moving across the face of the earth without touching the ground. And the goat was conspicuous because of a horn between his eyes. He's got one big horn, which of course is Alexander the Great. And he came to the ram with the two horns, which I'd seen standing by the banks of the canal. He ran at him in his powerful wrath, and I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, and he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. Okay. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. So the ram with the two horns, obviously Media Persia. The goat is obviously Alexander the Great and the Greek army. The crushing blows are a series of victories, more than five, but fewer than a dozen major battles that Alexander fought with the retreating Greek army all the way to Babylon. And then Alexander continued fighting, winning battles in minor skirmishes, really, all the way to the border with India. And at that point, his general said, "We've got to go back." They came back through Babylon, and having um, uh, uh, sent forces to Jerusalem. Alexander had been in Jerusalem by this time. But in Babylon, Alexander stopped for a while and he caught a cold or something. We really don't know what disease he came down with, but he caught some kind of bug and it killed him right there. He was still a relatively young man. His entire career spanned about 5 years' time. It was a very short time. And this was unexpected. There was no succession plan in line. Nobody knew what to do, and so the generals got together. And this is what's described here. When he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, when Alexander died, his 4 generals divided the kingdom up into 4 relatively large parts. Syria, which includes Israel, was given to a general named Seleucus. And all of the kings who follow Seleucus are called the Seleucid kings. And these will be kings in Syria for about 200 years, give or take. They don't all stop at the same time. But the Seleucid kings go down to about 168 or so BC in Israel and Syria. Egypt and big chunks of North Africa was given to a general named Ptolemy. The kings of Egypt are then called Ptolemaic kings, and they will continue to be kings in Egypt all the way down to the time of Christ. By that time, they're under Roman rule, but they continue to be Ptolemaic kings. Cleopatra is a queen in the Ptolemaic line. If you've ever heard of Cleopatra and Mark Antony and all of the intrigue that goes on there. The other 2 kings are not so important. The area of Macedonia was given to a general named Cassander, and Asia Minor was given to a general named Lysimachus. And those 2 have an essentially uninspired reign. And the kings of Macedonia and Asia Minor, respectively, slowly come around to the Roman side of the aisle. Macedonia became Roman long before Asia Minor did. Asia Minor was Roman by about 175 or 80 BC, something like that. Greece came around before that. And that was a slow-moving thing. But the important thing here is these 4 generals. The fact established in history that Alexander died at the height of his power, having achieved a great victory over Persia, and was replaced by 4 generals, makes it absolutely clear that chapter 8 is about Alexander and the Persians. It makes it absolutely clear. The other thing that's also very, very important is that this prophecy is literally fulfilled. There's no symbolism here. Well, there is symbolism. Alexander is not a literal ram or a literal goat, and Xerxes is not a literal ram. but the symbolism is easily understood, and it clearly refers to what we see here in this picture, the conflict between Persia and Greece, Alexander and Xerxes. It's clear, and it would take quite a bit of special pleading to get out from under what is going on there. Now, as the chapter goes on, we're going to get more and more emphasis on one of the Seleucid kings. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and the east and toward the glorious land. Okay, the south and the east, south would be toward Egypt, east would be across toward the desert. The glorious land, of course, is Israel. This is the promised land. So we ask ourselves, which king amongst all of these had control over the promised land? Well, that was the Seleucid king. And so let's think about which Seleucid king was the bad guy. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw to the ground, throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another one, Holy One, said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Okay, there are all kinds of difficulties in this passage, and I'm not going to solve them all for you. Everybody wants to know what are the 2,300 evenings and mornings. The simple answer is we don't know exactly. But we know that the Seleucid king who committed the abomination of desolation was a terrible tyrant. He was Antiochus II, whose other name is Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, who lived from, or well, actually reigned from about 175 to 170 or 164 BC. He was finally killed in the Maccabean revolts of 168 to 164 BC. The Maccabees, Judas the Hammer, Judas Maccabee, rose up against the Seleucid king Antiochus because Antiochus, Epiphanes, had sacrificed a pig on the altar of burnt offering in the temple in Jerusalem. It was just such a terrible thing that it deserved a revolution all its own. And this forms the basis for this paragraph. Historically, we know what Antiochus did. When we get into chapters 10 and 11, there's a lot more detail, a whole bunch more detail, most of which we won't go through, about Antiochus Epiphanes. I would argue that Antiochus he's a literal historical character who is a prefiguring an object lesson of a prince or king who is yet to come, an evil, willful, thoroughly bad and nasty tyrant of a king. The New Testament gives this character the name Antichrist. And I would argue that that's maybe not the best title for him, but it's what we're all familiar with. So it's is generally what we will use here. I think Antiochus is not he is not the Antichrist, because if Antiochus was the Antichrist, then the second coming of Christ would need to have happened by about 160 or so BC. And obviously that's absurd. It can't possibly have happened in that way. Antiochus is a type of the Antichrist. When we study his career, we learn some details about the one who is yet to come. One of the important reasons that I speak of that is that in chapter 9, we're going to run into the people of the prince who is to come. And the prince who is to come is not Christ, but rather the Antichrist, the opponent of Christ in the end time. That's what we're looking for. So the interpretation of the vision, as I mentioned before, a lot of these biblical prophecies have an interpretive paragraph tacked on. The interpretation of the vision begins in verse 15. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. This is an angel. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and Gabriel made, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Okay, there's the first thing that I want you to understand. While clearly the vision of the ram and the he-goat have to do with Persia and Greece, it's obvious that that's the beginning point. As we get further into this vision, the details of Antiochus Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation, these details are looking forward to a future evil king. And he's obviously a very important character. Antiochus is this Antichrist character. So he says, understand that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken, I fell into a deep sleep, and he said, behold, I'll make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. The latter end of the indignation is the trampling of Jerusalem. Remember, we've talked about the time of the Gentiles. It begins when Nebuchadnezzar took control of Jerusalem and continues all the way to the end of time until Jerusalem is no longer controlled by Gentiles. That will happen at the time of the second coming. So this end of the indignation refers to the last years of this time of the Gentiles prior to the coming of Christ. So let me go on. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. This is how I can know that Alexander and Xerxes are the kings involved. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom when the transgressors have reached their limits. A king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. Okay, there's a bunch in here that is important. It comes when everything is at the end of its time. The bold-faced king, or the arrogant king who understands riddles, will be of great power, but that power will come from outside of himself. The Antichrist himself is satanically empowered. Antiochus Epiphanes was probably demon-possessed. He was a thoroughly evil character, but he does not fulfill the entire prophecy. There's more that is yet to come. Fearful destruction. He shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. Okay, so the persecution of God's people will be a priority for this character. He is an anti-God character. In the New Testament, we use the term anti-Christ. The spirit of Antichrist that is already abroad in the world is the beginnings of that. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper, and under his hand and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. He shall rise against the prince of princes. The prince of princes is Messiah, the king, Christ himself. So this passage says he will be an anti-Christ. It's important for us to understand that this concept of the anti-God, anti-Christ character is not something that's invented by modern church people. This idea belongs all the way here in the book of Daniel. There it is explicitly. He shall rise up against the prince of princes, shall be broken, but by no human hand. The breaking of the Antichrist comes with the second coming of Christ. Christ himself will cast this character into the flames. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been told is true, but seal it up, for it refers to many days from now. So the 2300 is not a reference to the Hasmonean period or the intertestamental years. It's a reference to the very end of time. And when we add up 2300, it comes to about 7 years. Not quite. It's an interesting number. I'm not going to work that out for you right now because it doesn't matter, but it's interesting. And I, Daniel, was overcome, and I lay sick for some days, and I rose and went about the king's business. Okay, so there is chapter 8, and such a difficult chapter. It's a whole lot of history, but it's also looking forward to the great battles, the great conflicts, the great characters of the very end of time. Daniel is going to go on. Let's see if I can make the next slide come up. Into chapter 9. Chapter 9 of Daniel is usually called the 70 weeks of Israel. Suddenly we shift from the time of the Gentiles to the related clock of Israel. And actually, this passage gives us details about two things that are going on alternately. The Israel clock begins in 445 BC, and it counts down to the time of Christ. Then there's a gap, and then the 70th week of Daniel, the end of the Israel clock, is a 7-year, 70th week that comes at the very end of history. We are not there yet. Sometimes it feels like we need to be. Sometimes it feels like it would be nice if we could get done with this part of history and go on to the next. But we're not there yet. So the 70 weeks, the first couple of verses, I find it fascinating. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, by descent of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books that the number of years, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. And so the chapter 9 begins with the note that Jeremiah predicts a 70-year desolation. Oh, well, that's interesting. And if we dig through Jeremiah, we'll find this is a relatively minor note in Jeremiah. It comes in chapter 25, verse 10. In order to know this, a person would have to be a fairly intense student of the Old Testament. This is something that casual readers of the Old Testament would likely miss. But Daniel had read this, and Daniel had memorized this, and now Daniel is praying the scriptures. He knows what the scriptures say, and he knows that God intends to fulfill his promises in the scriptures, and so he's praying the promises of scripture. I really like that. I like the way that sounds. So I turned my face to the Lord, seeking him by prayer. And he's going to start off, and this continues down through verse 19. Daniel's confessing his own sin, the sins of his people. He recognizes that the judgment of the exile is entirely just, that the people have deserved this, that the punishment is a just thing. So we see that all the way down through verse 19, and then in verse 20, Gabriel responds. The angel Gabriel appears another time. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, presenting my plea before the Lord God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel I had seen in the vision came in swift flight, said, "O Daniel, I've now come to give you insight and understanding. At your beginnings of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I've come to tell you. For you are greatly loved, therefore consider the word and understand the vision." Okay, so Gabriel is coming in response to Daniel's prayer, and Daniel specifically is praying for his people and for his holy cities. That is, for the people of Israel and for the city of Jerusalem. And as we walk into this next section of the chapter, this is what we call the crux. This is the interpretive hard place that we have to understand in order for any of the rest of this to make much sense. What Daniel is laying out here, what actually Gabriel is laying out for Daniel, is a historical structure for what will happen with the rest of the history of Israel. Not just down to the coming of Christ, but all the way to the second coming and the beginning of the millennial kingdom. So it is apparent in this chapter that God continues to have a plan for the people of Israel, in spite of the fact that Israel will reject Christ as Messiah, which happened 2,000 years ago. In spite of their rejection of the Messiah, God will continue to work through the people of Israel down to the end of history. That's the point of this chapter. The details, I'm afraid, are really quite important, and so we're going to work through some of the details. And here's the way the vision goes from Gabriel, verse 24. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and for your holy city. The first problems is with the weeks, and I'll just make a mention of that. The word weeks is Shavat. It means 7. And most places in the Bible, when we see 7, it refers to 7 days. So on the 7th day, God rested. Okay, we have no problem with that. And 7 days makes a week. But what 7 days makes is a 7, actually. And it never hurts to ask 7 what? The Bible usually means 7 days, but it could mean 7 hours. So 70 times 7 hours is what? Not very long at all. A week and a half, something like that. So the end of the world comes in a week and a half. Okay, that doesn't work. 70 weeks of days is about a year and a half. And so the end of the world comes in what, 537 BC? It doesn't work. Months is never used anywhere in the Bible for a thing like 7s, but years is a possibility. If we take the 7s as a reference to years and we begin multiplying things out, some things begin to make sense. So 70 sevens of weeks would be a grand total of 490 years. It's entirely possible that the years in this prophetic section are not exactly 365 and a quarter days long. That gives us all kinds of interesting problems, and I'm not going to open that up. Sir Robert Anderson, in his 100-year-old book, The Coming Prince, argues that these years are actually 360 days long, and he makes or does the math to come up with a triumphal entry and some other things. Since his day, we're not quite so sure about the precision of that number. It's the Jewish year was somewhat more flexible than that. Let's see here. It doesn't really matter, but here it is. 70 weeks are decreed for your people, which has to be Israel. That's what Daniel was praying about. And your holy city, which has to be Jerusalem. That's what he was praying about. To do 6 specific things: to finish transgression, put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up both vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay, 6 specific conditions. To finish transgression means to see the acting out of the very last sinful act. To put an end to all of the sins of the world. Nobody will ever sin again. And I read the newspapers the same as everybody else. It looks to me like there are still transgressions going on. I was looking at the video of some riot the other night, and that looks sinful to me. Somebody was murdered. I don't know who the murdered man was or who the murderer was. It was an awful thing. That was sin. I don't care. It may have been sin on both of their parts. It was just wrong. Sin has not been completed yet. There are still sinners sinning out there. The second thing, the second condition is to put an end to sin. That's different than finished transgression. Finished transgression means come to the end of a sequence of sins. To put an end to sin means to utterly destroy the sin principle itself. The sin nature will no longer exist in the human race. Oh my! Oh, how's that going to happen? Well, that's the crux of the issue. To atone for wickedness. Now, the atonement was accomplished by Christ on the cross. This third condition, I think, was completed in the first coming of Christ. It may be that it will require the second coming to put a cap on it, but I don't know that that's necessarily so. To bring in everlasting righteousness, and again, that hasn't happened. The everlasting righteousness, the universal righteousness, simply doesn't exist yet, except in very small places. To seal up vision and prophecy. Vision and prophecy is biblical prophecy. This is starting with Genesis and looking all the way through Scripture. The Bible is full of prophecy. And about half of those prophecies have been fulfilled, but another half or so are yet to be fulfilled. The sealing up of vision and prophecy will happen when all of prophecy has been fulfilled, and that hasn't happened yet. To anoint the most holy, either the most holy one or the most holy place. The most holy place would be the Holy of Holies in the temple, which is very understandable. The most holy one would be the Messiah himself, and the anointing of the Messiah to be the king. And we could possibly understand that as happening in heaven, but I see no reason for it not to happen on earth at the beginning of the kingdom age. Both of these are possible. So when we look through the 6 conditions that have to be fulfilled before the end of the world comes, none of these have happened yet. And so it is obvious that the 490 years do not come to a conclusion sometime in the Old Testament era or sometime in the early New Testament era. They don't come to a conclusion with the coming of Christ or with the church age. They have not been fulfilled yet. And so we're looking at 490 years has stretched into well over 2,500 years. So we have to begin asking some questions. Therefore, know and understand. This is verse 25. Know and understand. Know the details, know the information, and have insight into what this means as an overall look at the purposes of God. God intends for us to understand this thing. It's not supposed to be hard. I know that it is, but it's not supposed to be. Okay, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Let's stop there in verse 26 and see what we can do with this. The beginning of this time, the 62 and the 7 weeks. which total 69. I'm not going to argue through the various views on how to take the 7 and the 62. Let's just go with 69 weeks, and it'll add up a little better. The beginning of this period is the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, not the temple. That's a different thing. There are two separate restorations of Jerusalem. The people of Israel began coming back from Babylon in relatively small numbers under Zerubbabel in about 525 BC, and the temple, the second temple, was rebuilt in a much smaller version of the temple during that time. It was kind of a sad time. It was a mournful time, but there was a rebuilt temple. But Jerusalem remained an unwalled city. It was not until Ezra and Nehemiah is the administrator, who asked the emperor for permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, rebuilding the walls is not a decorative thing. That has to do with with the people of Israel being a trusted minority within the Persian Empire to such an extent that they could have their own independent capital city, complete with walls. Without the walls, an army could just march right into the city. There would be nothing to stop that. Now they have the trusted independence to put up walls for protection against thieves and brigands and miscellaneous warlords in the local area. This is a very, very important move, and it was given under the Persian king in 445 BC. The actual date is known. We know March 14th of 445 BC, and we know this from Nehemiah 2 and verse 1. It's the text of the decree and all of this stuff is fairly well known. The 7 weeks, the 49 years, are what it takes to rebuild the wall, which was completed in about 396 BC. The entire 69 weeks go from 445 BC until the coming of Christ, and specifically until the triumphal entry of Christ. So Robert Anderson estimates this to be the 6th of April of 32 AD, and it's possible, but there are some modern arguments about that. It certainly was true. People during the time of the life of Christ who had studied the Bible carefully were expecting the Messiah at about the time that Jesus arrived. This was a time of expectancy, and Jesus did in fact arrive during that period. Now, in verses 26 and beyond, there is an after that time, after the 69 weeks. There's several things that happen in verse 26. Let's look at that. 62 weeks, motes and squares, but in troubled time. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. When the anointed one is the Messiah, the anointed king. To be cut off means to be killed without an heir, so that the kingdom cannot be set up. So it is the end of kingdom pretensions. Messiah is cut off. That happened when Jesus went to the cross. It is entirely credible to think that the 69 weeks take us all the way up to the triumphal entry of Christ. Here comes the king. acclaimed as the king. And then a week later, he is cut off and has nothing. And so we are now in the post 69th week period. What else is going to happen? After the 69th week, the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. Okay, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The destruction of Jerusalem happened in 70 AD under the Roman general Titus and his 10th Roman legion. Actually, there were two other legions that were involved, but the 10th legion was the lead group. The fact that an event happens after the 69th week and before the 70th week means that there is a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. That's just obvious. Let's say the crucifixion happened in 32 AD. The destruction of Jerusalem happens in 70 AD. That's 38 years. That's longer than 7 years. And there's no way to make it work. There's no way to come up with the end of history and the beginning of the millennium in, let's say, 39 AD. It just doesn't work. So there is an obvious gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And among other things, the destruction of the temple takes place at the hands of the people of the prince who is to come. Now, the prince who is to come has already been alluded to in chapter 8. This coming prince we're going to call the Antichrist. That's not the best name for him. The willful king, the man of sin, the son of perdition. He has a number of names. But Antichrist is a good enough name for him for our uses. That character will come from a specific people group. That's the people of the prince who is to come will destroy this city. For a long time, for several hundred years, scholars who look at this passage have assumed that this meant that the Antichrist would have to come from Rome, because obviously the 10th Roman legion destroyed Jerusalem. A more careful study of history, in particular the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus, give us a different story. In studying Tacitus, we discover that not only here, but throughout the Roman Empire at the time that Jerusalem was destroyed, the Romans used auxiliary troops. They used locally raised armies. And that the majority of the 10th Roman legion was Syrian. They were Arabs who lived in Syria. And they, according to Tacitus, hated the Jews with the hatred that is normal for neighbors. All through the Old Testament, I've spoken of the usual suspects, the nations that surround Israel, who are spoken of as the Gentiles or the nations, are primarily Arab, not all, but primarily Arab. And the near group is Arab. All of those Arabs and all of those non-Arab enemies of Israel who surround Israel are to this day Muslim. That's simply a fact. The people of the prince who is to come, that is the ethnic background of the Antichrist, has to be Arab and Muslim. I'm not convinced that the Antichrist is a practicing Orthodox Muslim, but I think the Antichrist comes from a Muslim background. Perhaps he was raised as a Muslim, Perhaps he has sympathies with the Muslim cause. I don't know. I don't. He appears to be an atheist, or at least an agnostic. We'll look at some more details as we go farther along. But let's look at what this is. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end will come to with a flood. And to the end there shall be desolations. There shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Okay, what is that? That's the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And he, verse 27, this is after the 69th week and after the destruction of Jerusalem. He, the prince who is to come. The he of verse 27 has to be the Antichrist. And there are several things that are going to happen in verse 27. The first is, he shall make a strong covenant with the many for 1 week. The many is usually assumed to refer to the people of Israel. It may be more than that. It may be with the whole worldwide community. Maybe he gets a United Nations decree. It's hard to know. But there is a covenant that will be good for, and this is the important part, 7 years. The 70th week of Daniel, the 70th week of Israel's clock, is defined by a peace treaty between the Arab world and Israel, put into place by the Antichrist. Now, I don't know who that is, and I don't know when that's going to happen, but that's what the Bible actually says. And there will be a strong covenant for a week. And for half of the week, he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. So there is a breaking of the covenant after 3.5 years. The second 3.5 years of the 70th week, the so-called tribulation period, is a time of great tribulation. When the covenant is broken, the temple is desecrated. We see the end of sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of desolation shall come one who makes desolate. That's the Antichrist, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. The outcome of the 70th week is that the desecrator, the Antichrist, will be utterly broken. Another thing that happens at that time is a gigantic war. We call it the Battle of Armageddon, or the Battle of Gog and Magog. And Israel, returned to the land, will fight against all of the surrounding nations in a vast, horrible war. Much of the rest of the world, I suspect, will be engulfed in this war. It will end with the second coming of Christ himself. The chart that you see on your screen starts in 445 BC, runs through 69 times 7 years, 483 years, to the time of Christ. There is a gap. We are currently in the church age. The church age will end, I believe, with the church taken out of the world, what Paul calls the rapture. And the 70th week, the day of Jacob's trouble, the time of judgment on Israel and on the nations, will happen during that 70th week. That's what the book of Revelation is all about. And during that 70th week, the Antichrist will reign. Israel will suffer. A vast multitude will become martyrs for Christ. This is a terrible time that has not yet happened on the earth. And that's what Daniel makes clear. When we get to the book of Revelation, which I suppose we should do one of these days, when we get to the book of Revelation, we see how the details are all unfolded. What John is doing in the book of Revelation is to expand on, to build on what Daniel has already set in place in his book. So I make the argument that Daniel and Revelation are two uh, they're two parts of a larger project, two parts of an important project that we can. Let's see here if I can make this happen. Okay, we can unmute now. Oh, and I can say hi. But we'll get back together again on Monday, and we'll finish up the book of Daniel. We'll go 10 through 12. I'm not going to go through all of the details of the rest of the book because it doesn't matter. If we can understand the three clocks of prophecy, the clock of Israel, the clock of the nations, and the clock of the church, they all fit together here. And we are in a place in history where God is preparing to bring all of history to a conclusion. It's an exciting time to be alive. And frankly, I'm happy to be sharing it with you. We'll come back together on Monday. God bless everybody. We love you guys. We look forward to seeing you in person. Could hardly wait. Oh, hi, Sally. I see you back there. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dr.
Bye bye, everybody. Love y'all. Hi, Dolly. I see you there. Yeah, I'm going to get the group
Bye.
view. Oh, yeah. Look at everybody. Hi, Eddie. How are you? Pastor Willie. God bless you, my friend. Pastor Roger. Good to see you guys. I love you guys. Pastor Eddie. Okay. I got to
Thank you,
go.
Gotcha.
All right. God
Thank
bless
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.